think of Beulah Land, purpose-driven comes to mind.
When I think of Beulah Land, the one word I think of is transparent.
The one word that comes to my mind when I think about Beulah Land is welcoming.
On February 19th, 1942, a God moment occurred here in Middle Georgia that would ultimately impact the whole entire world. Good evening and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Wanye Reese and I hope you're ready because we're going to take you on a journey this evening talking about the history of Beulah Land Bible Church. It was on that day that God summoned a small group of believers to gather at a home of Mrs. Lily Mae Chatfield, located at 132 Phillips Lane in Macon, Georgia. The purpose of the meeting was to organize a church. 4 ministers were present: Pastor S.N. Nelson, Pastor F.O. Stadium, Pastor J.H. Hudson, and Pastor E.E. Edmonds Sr.
My grandfather, Reverend E.E. Edmonds, was a wise and kind man, full of joy, always wanted to help someone. He stood tall, not tall in stature, but tall to me as a giant in my eyes. I'm the oldest of 7, and I was able to stay with my grandparents on the weekends sometime and in the summer. I was so glad. But every Saturday, Grandmama, she would prepare the meals and get the clothes ready and get everything ready for us to attend church on Sunday. And then on Sundays, we were at church all day long. Sometimes we would have to go out of town to the different churches that Granddaddy would pastor and be a visitor pastor. And the mothers of the church would fix dinner, which I was glad. And they treated us so kind. Granddaddy, he was so thankful for anything that anyone would do for him. And he was always looking and trying to help someone else, not thinking about himself, but making sure that everybody else was all right.
Where we're here at our Elm Street location, and we have some of our members who have been here, who've been a part of Beulah Land Bible Church for quite a while. First of all, there are some of you who've been a member under all 5 pastors. Let me see who you are. Just raise your hand if you've been a member under all 5. All right. Thus, you were here under Pastor Edmund, who was the first pastor of Beulah Land Missionary Baptist Church at the time. And so there are many who are part of the Beulah Land Bible Church family but have no idea of who Pastor Edmund was, his spirit, and you guys had firsthand experience. And so just share a little bit about Pastor Edmund from just being under his leadership.
He was a friendly pastor. And he used to preach. And I remember him, I was a child, but I remember him skipping across the stage when he preached. And he was a good pastor.
And he would raise hymns. And I used to love to hear him sing those, the gospel hymns and everything in the church. Had the whole church patting and clapping. So.
Without music, too.
Without music.
Yeah, without music.
The music
and I was young, but I remember that. Mm-hmm. I mean, he was a friend. He was our pastor, our leader. I mean, he was just like one of us. He just talked with us, hugged us, loved us. Him and his wife, really did.
The newly elected officers were led to name the church Beulah Land Missionary Baptist Church. They held services on the 2nd and 4th Sundays of each month at Mrs. Chatfield's home until the church moved to a vacant home on White Street on August the 26th of 1942. Soon the membership began to grow and a lot was purchased at 2286 Ashley Street with plans to build a new facility. On the 2nd Sunday in September of 1945, Pastor Edmund and the members of Beulah Land marched into their new sanctuary.
Although I was not born when the church was organized, I was told the stories of how it was organized by my grandmother. My granddad would preach all over Middle Georgia, going to different little towns and preaching at different churches. Well, one night on his way home from preaching a revival, he was stopped on a dark road by Ku Klux Klan. And they went across the road and they stopped him. And my grandmother said that he was so scared, he was so frightened until he wet his pants. And they asked him, "Where are you going this time of night?" The N word, of course. And he told them, "Sir, I'm a minister, and I just finished preaching, and I'm on my way home." And they let him go, and he went home. But grandmother said that he was so frazzled when he got there. That's when the two of them sat down and said, "You got to stop doing all this traveling. It's not safe." And that's where the thought of Beulah Land started.
I got to know Pastor Edmund he would come through our neighborhood, and sometimes his car we wouldn't have no car to ride in, but he would still walk through the neighborhood, and he would be collecting kids as he was going through, and we would all go down with him. He in the midst, and we laughing and talking, skipping and playing. But when we got to the church, it was always Pastor Edmund. He was a father to a lot of us that didn't have no fathers. He was a father figure, and you could talk to him, and he didn't never talk in a loud voice. He always had a calm voice, but you know when he talked, he was talking from his heart, and he was more of a daddy to every one of us. And that I'm talking about spiritually, physically, and whatever. He was a father to us.
I was born in 1961, and my grandfather had a stroke in 1961. So I never got the chance to actually see him preach. But all of his friends, anyone in the Middle Georgia area, you would say his name and they would just start rattling off stuff about him. Reverend Edmund, yes, Reverend Edmund, such a good man, such a good man. And they would tell you different things about him, how he would swerve around in the pulpit, how he would put his hand behind his ear as if he was hearing what God was saying to him. And he would just be fluently going. And as my sister told you, he didn't read, but he read the Bible. And it's so good to get a pastor that loves his people. That to me, that's a gem.
It is.
It's a gem to get a pastor that really loves his people. He and my grandmother worked side by side. They started the church in someone's living room. So they wanted to build a church. My grandmother and grandfather, they put their house up for the mortgage to a church. They put their house up to pay for the church. And that's how the first Beulah Land building was started.
In 1964, Pastor Edmund's health necessitated he resign as pastor of Beulah Land Missionary Baptist Church. On May 9th, 1964, Pastor A.L. Hudson accepted the invitation to become the second pastor of Beulah Land Missionary Baptist Church. Pastor Hudson was an educator in the school system. He was also known for teaching the Word of God and his love for people. Due to the continuous growth of the membership, the church relocated from Ashley Street to 656 L Street. The first worship service at the L Street location was held on February 27th of 1972.
Just tell us a little bit about Pastor Hudson as a pastor. What kind of pastor was Pastor Hudson and person was Pastor Hudson?
I remember when my brother died and he came to my house, the first thing he asked was, what do you need? And that was him. He made sure that you didn't want anything. If you needed a job, he would help you get jobs. You know, whatever it is you needed, he would help you do that. He hired, when my brother was in high school, he told my mama to keep him out of trouble. He hired my brother to clean his yard and, you know, do the odd stuff around his house. And my brother was killed in an automobile accident in '72. And he came to the house. This first thing he said, what do you need? What do you want?
What I remember from Pastor Hudson, he was a generous man. He always had his members first hand on first choice. No matter if he left town, if anything happened with his members, he was gonna come back. He's gonna come back. Whatever he's gonna drop and come back to see about his member. And I would be eternally grateful. Because my sister, I have a sister that had lupus. And it was a trying time. And he stuck with us. One time my sister was in the hospital and we had to jump up and run, he was always there. And he would always check with my mama to make sure my mama was doing okay. But he was, his church, his members, he looked after us. And that was nothing too early, late at night or too early in the morning, you couldn't call him. And that's one, I'll never forget him for that.
What I loved about Pastor Hudson, he was a friendly man, he was a caring man, and he loved his people, his memorabilia. One thing about Pastor Hudson, if you got sick, he's gonna be there for you. You go to the hospital, he's gonna be there. At the house, he's gonna be there. He came to my house a couple of times. And anytime he came to the house, or even the hospital, he's gonna put something in your hand. That's the kind of man he was. But he really was a man, character, high-esteem man, a joy man. And he just, he cared about people. One thing about Pastor, a lot of people say that he wasn't an outstanding pastor preacher, but one thing I love about Pastor Bill, he would teach.
He sure, yeah, he was a good teacher.
He wasn't a good holler.
Right.
He wasn't holler.
But he would teach you.
Yes.
That's what I loved about him.
Yes, he would.
And he had told me, he said, Deacon Lawson, he said, I even go to the white churches. They invite him to come speak a lot of times. He was just that kind of man. Now, I really appreciate Pastor Hudson. He was caring. He was concerned about his church. And he would always, if we just like when we got rid of him, he would say, well, if y'all pay so much,
right,
I'll take care of the rest.
Right, he sure would.
That's right. He was a good guy.
I remember this Pastor Hudson because when I had a house fire, my house got burnt down, and him and his wife gave me furniture to refurnish my house. And when I was in the hospital, he visited me at the hospital and everything. And he was just he was an outstanding and caring preacher and pastor, and he loved his members at the church too. And I looked at him as a great pastor.
I remember one of our members' house burned down, not far from here, and the fountains. And that night, Pastor Hudson was there. It was members from Beulah Land all around. We just met at their house and see what we could do for that family. Pastor Hudson was right there trying to do what he could do.
How was the worship services?
The worship service was, he like to say he was the teacher.
Yes.
But you know, before Pastor Hudson died, he was really preaching. And I remember one thing about him, he used to say, he would be preaching, and when nobody responded, he'd pull the chair up there and say, amen. I remember that about him too.
Yes.
But he was really preaching before he passed away. But when he first came to us, he was just like our teacher. He was a good teacher.
He knew his memory, no matter how long. If you were gone for a while and you came back,
he knows you.
He knew who you were. He knew who you were. Yeah.
And I remember him always trying to recruit for the church. And I remember at some point when I joined, I think we had like 58 members or whatever, but my parents had joined the church. And he came to my house to conduct my brother's wedding. And he was there recruiting. He was like, me and my sister, y'all need to come join Beulah Land. You know? So that's how I ended up joining Beulah Land in July of 1984. But he was a good man and a good preacher.
Well, I am just delighted and honored to have this opportunity to talk about my father, the late Reverend Dr. Alvin L. Hudson, who pastored Beulah Land Baptist Church from 1964 to 1989 when he passed away. He is still the longest tenured pastor of Beulah Land. And so he was a wonderful man, at least in my eyes, and I'm prejudiced because I was a daddy's little girl. And but he loved being a pastor. He loved preaching. He loved serving God, and he loved serving the people of Macon and throughout. During the time when he was called to Beulah Land in 1964, he was a new preacher. That was his very first church. He was a new preacher, excited about ministry. He and my mother had been married approximately 3 years. And I had come into the world, I had been into the world maybe 1 year, but he came to Beulah Land as a young pastor, and he started his ministry there. The church at that time had been started back in the 40s, I believe, with a group of people. My grandfather, my father's father, the Reverend J.H. Hudson, was a part of that group, and my grandmother, Sally Fanny Hudson. They worked tirelessly to get this church started with the Edmonds, Rosa Edmonds and Reverend E. Edmonds, who they were neighbors as well on Chapel Street. So in Macon, South Macon. And so Reverend Edmond, as he was declining in health, Daddy was coming out and preaching, and they called him to preach as the second pastor.
And up under Pastor Hudson, you know, there were times that I had to do the devotion by myself. But we had some praying mothers, and we had some mothers would do songs. They would strike out with songs.
Right.
Those mothers sit over there that amen come.
Yes.
And they would strike them some. Mother West.
Yes, Lord.
Mother Selma. Mother Joan.
Yes.
I mean, they would scrap out with them songs.
Amen.
There was some praying mothers.
Yes.
You know, we had a good time with Beulah, you know.
So Deacon Lawson, since you had to lead it by yourself, give us a sample of.
Got me over.
Yes, sir.
Baby, through this barren land.
Yes.
I'm weak, but thou art mighty. Hold me with thy power hand.
Yes.
Guide me, O God, praise thee, O Lord, through this
Yes, sir.
hold me with thy power hand.
And so he did, and that was his sweetheart church, and he loved that church, and he pastored another church in the city of Macon, and he let them know unashamedly that he would not leave Beulah Land. They had to accept him on those terms. And he pastored both of them until the day he died. So the culture at that time in Macon and much of the South was unrest, pretty much like it is now. What we're seeing now, what some of you younger people would see now of the racism, the injustices that are going on, were going on in the 60s very heavily. And so he was also, as Reverend Hudson, as a graduate from Morehouse College, during the tenure of Benjamin E. Mays as a president, the men that graduated from Morehouse were pretty much trained to preach. A lot of preachers went to that school, theologians and things of that nature, but they also were taught to be active in their communities. Benjamin E. Mays had a saying that he told the men of Morehouse that if you go somewhere and live more than 6 months and then you leave and nobody knows you've been there, you haven't done a thing. Always let people know you're there. And he let people know that he was there in Macon. My father did. And so the culture needed men who would stand up, who would use the church, not only for us to go and attend and to worship and give our praises and honor to God, but it was also a place where in the Black community, the church was the strong foundation, one of the strong foundation. We found our strength, we found our information. We educated our children through information passed on in the school. So the pulpit at that time in the Black community was very instrumental in bringing about change, as well as the Black family, which in a way is different now in the Black family, does not have the stronghold as the Black family did then. We stuck together, we fought together, we prayed together, and we grew together. And so he was very pro-family, pro-church, pro-education. Children, get your education, go to school, learn as much as you can, share as much as you can, and be all that you can.
Pastor Hudson served faithfully for 25 years until his death in November of 1989. After his death, the church was without a shepherd for 6 months. On May 5th, 1990, Pastor E. Dewey Smith Jr. was extended the invitation to become the third pastor of Beulah Land Missionary Baptist Church.
E. Dewey Smith. Wow. E. Dewey was electrifying. He was a pastor. He was relevant to the time. Everything that went on in the world of that day, that was a sermon. The next week, we knew about it. He taught us how to love. He taught us how to pray. And tithing. That was the biggest thing I learned under Smith, is tithing, to give your first to God. So I grew under Pastor Smith with tithing, and as I said, family. He was big on family. He was up to date with everything culturally that was going on in the world.
Well, when I met him, he was Pastor Smith, and then later on he became Dr. Smith. But I used to tell him, I called him Chief. I said, Chief, you give people what I call the STP treatment. What I mean, he would speak it, he would teach it, and then he would preach it. And some would say that he would even sing it, because a young man could sing, and back home we would say the brother could sing. So again, he would give you the STP treatment all in one.
As we celebrate 80 years, church family, you can't talk about Beulah Land Bible Church and consider the history of Beulah Land Bible Church without mentioning the Dr. E. Dewey Smith Jr. Thank you so much for sitting down with me and going down memory lane.
Dr. Kelly, I'm honored to be here, and I appreciate you and for just the invitation and a great job you're doing in leading that church, man. What a blessing. I'm honored to be here.
Bless you. Thank you so much. I guess the place we'll start is that when we go back to 1990, and what's the story of how God brought you and Beulah Land together as pastoring people?
Now, it's amazing because it really precedes 1990. You know, my great-grandmother, Amanda Brown Smith, was a mother at Beulah Land. And my family at that time went to Beulah. Half of them went to Beulah, the other half went to Beulah Land. So my great-grandmother was a mother at Beulah Land, and my grandfather kind of frequented both churches. And my dad went between both churches as well with his grandmother when they were on Ashley Street under Pastor Edmund. And so when Pastor Edmund became ill, my grandfather, Amanda's son, my grandfather, Jack Smith, actually filled in preaching for him for about 2-3 years, from 1961 up until he passed away and his health made him resign. And so it actually precedes me. My relationship with Beulah Land, it's in my lineage. But in November of 1989 is when Pastor Hudson became ill, second pastor, and he invited me to come and preach for him. He pastored Tremont Temple downtown. It was downtown at that same time, and so I would go and preach for him on second and fourth Sundays when he was ill. Actually, October of '88, and then he passed away in November of '89. And when Pastor Hudson passed away, the second pastor, after serving for about 25 years, they called me to come and preach for them in March. I was in college at the time. Deacon Lawson and Deacon Jimmy Booz, who's with the Lord now, called me about coming to preach for them second Sunday in March because the pastor they had scheduled couldn't come. And so I went the second Sunday in March of 1990 to preach for them, to fill in for them, and never left and stayed about 14 years. And so I was 19 and a loving church, didn't have a lot of resources. We were in that building on L Street, and the building was dilapidated. Termites had eaten the building. So the physical structure was not in the best shape, but the love of the people and the commitment and the love for community and the love of Christ was there. And so we went, and God was faithful, man. Just a loving church, and they've always been that way, and they're still that way to this very day. And you feel it now yourself.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. So you knew Pastor Hudson.
Absolutely.
Tell us a little bit about Pastor Hudson, those who may know or not know.
Yeah. Pastor Alvin Hudson was actually a friend of my grandfather, Jack Smith, and a friend of my father. He pastored Tremont Temple Baptist, and he was a Morehouse man. He was also an educator, taught at Northeast High School and a few other places in Bibb County. And a distinguished gentleman. He was a part of the New Era Convention, and just a magnetic personality. He was the father-in-law of Pastor Aaron Jones, who pastored at Bellevue Baptist from Macon, and before coming to Hunter Hill in Atlanta, and now he's in Philadelphia. And so his father was also a pastor, pastored many years in Middle Georgia. And so Pastor Hudson was a distinguished gentleman, tall, about 6'4", incredible personality, incredible laugh. And so Tremont Temple was his every Sunday church. They met 4 Sundays, full time. And of course, Beulah Land was the second and fourth Sunday church. And so my great-great-uncle, L.J. Brown, who's the brother of Matthew Brown, who pastored Beulah Baptist, was his assistant pastor. And so Pastor Hudson, wanted to always, he was big on education and big on the AU Center and big on HBCUs. And so when he came to my initial sermon in '88, and we just developed a rapport. We would often have the Emancipation Proclamation services at Tremont Temple. And so I would sing at his church, for throughout the years as a high school student when they have various programs at Tremont Temple. And so he said what he meant what he said, and he loved Beulah Land. As a matter of fact, the balcony that was in the L Street church was his gift when he remodeled the church in the late 60s. He personally funded that so the balcony could be put in the L Street location. About 15, 20 people up in the balcony, but that was his gift to put stairs up there to create a little more room in the L Street campus. And so trying to pastor 2 churches and be an educator, you know how difficult that can be when you're bivocational. And so I would go over with my great-grandmother sometimes to revivals when Pastor Parker would preach the revival every July. And I would go over periodically when I was a teenager and sing or play the piano. But when he became ill, I'm not quite sure when he became ill, but this was in '88. I'd just been preaching a few months, and he called himself to ask me to come down and preach for him. And I preached for him the second and fourth Sundays of October, and went back the second Sunday in November to preach for him, and would go periodically when he would become ill between after that. And so this was October, November of '88, and he passed away in November. Thanksgiving Day of '89 is when he passed. But love Beulah Land, love Middle Georgia, love the community, baptized many people, and just had a heart for the ministry, really did.
So how old were you when you became the pastor?
19.
19 years old.
19 years old.
So how was it to follow a seasoned pastor such as Pastor Hudson?
Yeah, it was it was tough because being so young, and of course Deacon Jimmy Williams and Deacon Booz and Deacon Lawson. We had 3 deacons at the time, and Sister Ola Mae Booz and Sister Lawson, were the main leaders in terms of deacons and deaconess. And of course, Deacon Lawson's still there now. Sister Lawson just passed recently and did a wonderful, phenomenal job eulogizing her a few months ago. But they were there, and of course, Deacon Lawson's daughter, Michelle, and I, we knew each other from 3rd grade. Went to Winship Elementary together. And so Michelle would often advocate, with her father on my behalf. And another minister, Moses Herring, who's Deacon Lawson's brother-in-law, he grew up under Pastor Hudson as well in the church. And so he had an affinity for me because my father and him were very, very good friends. And so I was young, and of course, we didn't have a lot of bylaws or constitutions or things of that magnitude, but they had a respect for leadership. And although I was young, and they gave me an opportunity, and I tried to be very, very inclusive in terms of getting their opinions. And I think what helped me actually was just being able to relate to the younger people. As some of the younger people and their children and grandchildren, really began to have a relationship with the church, it gave me some kudos, I guess, some cool points with people like Deacon Lawson and a few others who Deacon Booz's granddaughters, great-granddaughters eventually joined the church. And so it became a family affair. The leaders, when their children and grandchildren came, it just kind of pushed it to another level. And that made it a little easier.
So got a chance to talk to a remnant that actually has been at Beulah Land under all 5 pastors.
Wow.
Got to talking about you as the young pastor, something that just really just made me laugh. They was telling me how serious you were about teaching and preaching the Word of God, and you were so serious that you would teach Bible study, and then after Bible study, you would give them a test.
Yeah.
And they had to take a written test. They knew when they came to Bible study, they had to listen and pay attention because there might be a test that they would have to take. And so talk about those memorable early years being there.
Amazingly, we didn't have a Bible study during the week originally,
okay.
Because Pastor Hudson, was at Tremont, an educator. So Bible study was not a consistent kind of thing prior to my arrival. He would do maybe once a month. He would do BTU quarterly, but it wasn't a consistent Bible study that was pastor-led. And so implementing Bible study each week, because of course, when you're a new pastor, I didn't have any other obligations other than school. I had a little more time than Pastor Hudson did, and so, but I would drive from Atlanta, because I was like, okay, if I'm going to pastor the church, I got to be there. I kind of learned that if I'm going to pastor, I got to be present. And so, in driving a 91 Toyota Corolla Tercel that went 35 miles per hour down here with the wind behind it, if I'm going to drive this far and spend this time, I want to make sure it's purposeful and that, we're actually getting something. And by me being in school, I was already in that kind of frame of mind. And I was like, if we're going to spend this time together, I want to make sure that they're getting something from it. And so, man, we started to do it. And I was just trying to find a way to make sure they were engaged. And they eventually started liking the test more than we did. So everything I was doing in school, I would take it down there. I was teaching Greek to them and Hebrew and, just whatever I was getting in school, I'd just go down there and teach it to them. Right. And I think it kind of created some camaraderie and some momentum, just being able to come and have a Bible study that actually was more fun than worship at the time. you know, because we had the consistency. We could engage and kind of ask questions and go back and forth. You know, church, you have to just listen, but it gave me an opportunity to kind of build some relationships, I think, and that have lasted throughout the years.
So when did Beulah Land transition from a second and fourth Sunday church to having church every Sunday?
When I was called to become the pastor, Deacon Lawson and Deacon Booz and Deacon Williams and I had a conversation. Maybe in June of '90, we had a conversation about just going every Sunday. I think it was the desire of many people for a long time to go every Sunday. But of course, Pastor Hudson had another full-time church. So that was just a lot. And I think he was a moderator of an association one time. So it's just a lot to be a pastor, an educator, have two different churches. And so I think they began to kind of evolve and kind of shift and made the decision that we should go every week. So I think it was like June of '90, we said we're going to try it. And it was actually Deacon Lawson's recommendation that we push it to try to go every Sunday. And we started, you know, adding different Sundays. And by September of '90, it was every Sunday. Yeah.
And through that process, you experienced explosive growth.
You know, it's amazing. You know, you probably wouldn't believe it. I was, you know, very athletic inclined back then. And right behind the church is Memorial Gym on L Street. And so we played ball at the gym every weekend. I was playing basketball and softball every week. And we started a softball league. And actually it was that partnership between Memorial Gym, playing basketball every Saturday in the gym, and softball, that we developed the basketball league and the church softball league. And me being active, very active each week, I'll come for choir rehearsal or, you know, or clean the church, or, you know, because I was the custodian and the janitor, all that kind of stuff, and, you know, and the piano player. So I would come for choir rehearsal and go back and play ball with the guys, and then take a few guys from the church to play ball with the guys at the gym. And from those interactions, the guys would just start coming to church, and then, you know, their wives or their girlfriends and their mothers, and so it's kind of organic thing, you know. It was just, you know, just being in the community right at that gym. And I think being at Memorial Gym every week created momentum for people just to be excited about a young pastor and a young church, giving them opportunity to come where, you know, you didn't have to necessarily be dressed every week, and trying to put some vibrant worship and just teach the Bible. But I think it was really through that connection with Memorial Gym. You know, guys would, you know, I would tell the ushers, you know, let them come, and, you know, some of them are going to be inebriated, but let them come on anyhow, you know, and don't make it too difficult for them to come. And we had about 20 guys who we were connected to with the gym who ended up becoming preachers, men and pastors, right through that connection. That happened right there between. We developed softball leagues that lasted years, but it was a great, great connection. But a lot of it happened through sports, actually. And, man, they would come to that church. The church, you know, not a large building at all, but the love that Beulah Land has always exhibited, plus young energy and the wisdom of the old, was a great kind of connection. And God used the wisdom of the people who had been there and the energy that was coming from those who were uniting, and just allowed me to be a part of it. And I'm just glad. It was things I will never, ever forget.
So when I did join Beulah Land in the 1990s under Pastor E. Dewey Smith, it reminded me of my former church of holiness. We would run around, we would jump, we would shout. Some Sundays we wouldn't even have a sermon. We would just praise and worship the whole 2-3 hours. It was long. Everybody in the city knew that Beulah Land was long. We would be from 11 to 3 o'clock. We were very long, but that shortened out over time. But it was very electrifying.
Beulah Land at the time was a church that whereby the pastor was just preaching, and it was growing by leaps and bounds, and needed someone to actually come in and handle or oversee operations. So fortunately, I was given the opportunity to serve as the chief operating officer under Dr. Smith and Dr. Watson. And I tell you, it is an experience that I will always treasure, and I'm thankful for it. I think it is a calling when you work for a nonprofit, because you're dealing with all of God's children in every different facet. I mean, people fail to realize that the church is a corporation. We deal with everything that everybody else is, communication, marketing, volunteer service, you name it, that is what we did. And fortunately, I've been able to serve on leadership who allowed us to grow and prosper in that.
And speaking of that, the energy of the young and the wisdom of the old, you have those dynamics of a growing church. You have the commitment from the seasoned saints, but then now this fresh energy from younger. How did you merge that those two demographics together in harmony?
That's a great question. You know, I think one of the things is our offer was about $300 a week at the time when I went to Beulah. Yeah, that's tithes and offerings, about $300 a week. And so the blessing is, as the young people were coming, whatever they brought was appreciated. You know what I mean? And because we didn't have a whole lot of ministries for younger people, the blessing for us at the time was we were able to implement new things without really offending a lot of the older people. Gotcha. It was a great time because we didn't have to dismantle anything or remove anybody to start something. Right. Sometimes it's easier that way versus having people who are already in leadership. It's time to segue and change and transition, and they don't want to let it go. Yeah. So one of the things that helped us there was that reality that we could do a lot of new things, new Bible studies, and family conferences and the men's group, things that weren't there already. So it did not offend anybody or did not intimidate anybody. And then the other piece was a lot of the young people that were coming were relatives of those who had already been there. So they just were happy to have their granddaughters and nieces and nephews back in church, or being active in church, that it really made it a loving and a non-contentious kind of environment. So it was just a great time, great timing, and we didn't have to dismantle a whole lot, which I'm so thankful for because, as you know now, when you get into church now and it's developed and you're trying to implement, it's a difficult nuance.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So, two-part question. So, how long was it before you realized we got to start looking for another place to worship? We've outgrown this place. And then how did you end up on Newberg?
It's amazing. The first year was tough. I was just excited to have a church. I was driving down every week and doing the teaching. So I was down there 2 or 3 times a week. But the building was in such poor shape. Termites had eaten the back of the annex, and the sanctuary hadn't been really renovated since the early 60s, late 60s, I'm sorry. And so we decided we had to make some decisions. People would walk through the campus to get to the gym, and it was a passway, so a lot of people were fearful to come at nighttime because guys would walk back and forth. So about a year into this church, me being there in '91, we did a renovation. I brought some hammers and some 2x4s, and we took all the sheetrock down, and I kind of, general contracted the project, and we renovated the church and put new carpet in and put a new baptism pool in. And at the end of '91 is when we start to see it just take off, begin to grow. And inevitably in '92, we decided we had to go to a second service. And we had an early morning service, and we bought land in '93 on Burton Avenue. Actually, it's where New Hope Baptist Church is now. Our intention was to bought about 10 acres that we're going to build there. But then February 19th of '94, because I graduated college in '93, and the church was growing. We had 2 services, but in February of '94, on February 19th of '94, I was at my mother's home, and because I was still going back and forth to seminary at the time, and I read the Macon Constitution, Macon Telegraph, and in the religious section, they had the picture of this church, Central Fellowship, which I had seen my entire life, driving them down 75. Loved the church, had beautiful stained glass windows that would light up at nighttime. And I said, man, that's a beautiful church. That would be a beautiful church. And they were selling the building. This is February 19th. Ironically, that was the same day we were having a prayer breakfast. And so I took the article over there. We had prayer breakfast. And the Lord said, ask the people to follow you over to Newberg. So it's about maybe a little over a mile from L Street to Newberg. And we traveled down a second, turn right, and we had a caravan. And when we got to Newberg, because I'd never been in the building before, we got to Newberg and drove up in there. As we were arriving, the secretary was leaving. And I told her who I was. We had about 30 people with us for the prayer breakfast. I showed her the newspaper article, told her who I was when I was pastoring and how I was just led to come. And she told us all to come in and have a tour. And we came in and toured the facility, and the members just were blown away because the sanctuary resembled the model that we were talking about building on Burton Avenue. And we came in and we looked at it, and we only had about $12,000 in the bank at the time because we just bought the land on Burton Avenue. And we looked at the place, and the Lord said, let's march around it. And we marched around that thing 7 times. And we went back and we came up with a 12-week campaign where we had to raise $80,000 to be able to buy the campus. So, yeah, I think we had $8,000 in the bank. And yeah, it's between 8 and 12. Don't quote me on it, but it's in that range. And I told the people, said, you know, I know we bought the land, but it's going to be easy to build this. It's closer to our demographic. And we came up with nearly all of the money. And Lemuel Hallman, who was one of our trustees at the time, he lived in Bellevue. He loaned us $5,000. Eddie Tukes, who was my guitar player, loaned us $5,000. And my wife, who's my girlfriend at the time, loaned us $10,000. And that gave us the money we needed. And we closed on the building June 1st, 1994. Yeah. So from February 19th, we saw it. June 1st of 94 is when we closed on it.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a God story right there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you get into Newberg, 1010, and does it immediately blow up, or?
Yeah, we bought the campus, and we had about 450 members by the time we bought the church. When we bought the church, we were at 450. When I went there, we had 48 people. So we're about 450. It's about 4. So about 4 years later, we come from 48 to 450. We marched in January the 2nd of 94. Yeah, January 3rd was going to be the first worship service, which was before 4th of July. And people came out. It was an amazing experience. The very next week, there was a flood that hit Middle Georgia, flooded from Macon to Albany. We were without water for 6 weeks. Wow. Yeah, the whole area. So we had to go to they set up water stations with fire department would bring bottles of water. So many people, Albany was flooded, 75, it was just a mess. So if you wanted to wash clothes, you had to go to Forsyth or Warner Robins, no water. Yeah, you had to cook. So you literally taking a bath with jugs of water. So imagine moving into your church 1 week, and we're supposed to have the dedication services the next week, and the flood hits, and there's no water. No water, and you still want to have church, and we need every penny to make the payments because we still had the land, and we still got oh my goodness, when I tell you, it was the most trying time, but people found a way to come to church. They found a way to come to church. Yeah.